My dear brothers and sisters, I would like to begin with a small passage from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 23, 32 to 34. Two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." As a kid, while being taught the Ignatian method of meditating, where you imagine yourself to be one of the actors in the gospel passage and try to feel exactly what is happening, I was told to put myself on the cross and feel the pain and look at those who killed me. I was then to concentrate on the above 3 verses. Kids take life seriously. So here I was, watching the crowd below, unbearable pain in my arms and legs and head. And now I have to say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." My imagined pain was too much. No way, not those guys who nailed me to the cross. In fact, I really started trembling. How could one have forgiven his torturers in a complete, uncalled for and unconditional way like Jesus did on the cross? It is just impossible. But if it were a movie, the story might have ended there. His executioners would have been touched, and he could have been brought down from the cross, and all could have been well again. As we all know, it did not. It is an impossible moment, but that really happens in the real world. It is a moment of the divine which transcends the human. It is like the transfiguration, where the divine is revealed in the human, for no mere human could have done this. No wonder Alexander Pope, this devout poet, as quoted popularly, said it so beautifully. To err is human, to forgive is divine. About 15 years ago, I was asked to reflect on the same words at the 7 Words on the Cross service on Good Friday in Pilar. As I sat to reflect on the sheer impossibility of these words, rather than going into the Ignatian imagination method again, I tried to make it real time for me. I reflected to find out which people I needed to forgive at this moment. Friends, just let some people pass before your minds just now as you listen to me, who you think have hurt you, or you think you have hurt, and so need to be forgiven. At that moment, I let go emotionally to allow my emotions to come forth. My experience was shuddering. I recoiled even physically when I thought of a couple of persons who I needed to reach out to. I analyzed my emotions and thoughts as I went through this exercise. Immediately, justification sprang forth. I am right and he is wrong. Why should I forgive? This was my first line of defense against forgiveness. My sense of apparent justice gives me an alibi to move away. Let him first come to me. Why should I approach him? This is another escape route used by superiors with subjects or parents with children. Another excuse that came to my mind was, I did what I did. I cannot help it now. C'est la vie. What happened is the past. Move on. This happens a lot without taking the pain of the pained into consideration. Some people today see forgiveness as a sign of weakness. And parents today even teach their own children to be tough. In other words, go ahead. And people who love power or power people, whether in civil, political, or even religious or ecclesiastical life, would definitely not forgive, for they would be seen as weak. Was Jesus weak on the cross? I think these emotions and thoughts are common to all of us and apparently humanly justifiable. Listen to the compelling voice of one woman. I've walked away from the big forgive in my life. Every time I saw some version of that sermon, forgive in order to heal, or you're only hurting yourself if you don't forgive, I debated what it meant for the family member who sexually abused me. I finally said, forget it. Sometimes I'm angry, sometimes I'm at peace. I remember being in a class with a young Bosnian and a young Croatian. The sparks that flew between them were not understandable to me. How can you, when you know that they have relatives who have killed each other, and these youngsters have seen it? I wonder what I would have done. I had a young Palestinian in my class. You could see the humiliation and anger in his eyes. He had lost his family of 9. The Black Lives Matter movement represents the humiliation of the Africans over centuries. I could go on and on. This is public history, and such events take place in our own personal lives as well. 2 Jewish philosophers of modern times confronted this question, especially because of the unimaginable cruelty and inhumanity of the Nazis against the Jews. Vladimir Yankelovich, who died in 1985, postulated broadly, to put it broadly, that it was not possible to forgive these for various reasons, which I would not go into here. On the other hand, Jacques Derrida, who died in 2004, also a postmodern Jewish philosopher, perhaps reflects the life of Jesus more than anything when he says, forgiveness is true forgiveness when it forgives only the unforgivable. If one is only prepared to forgive what appears forgivable, what the church calls venial sin, then the very idea of forgiveness would disappear. If there is something to forgive, it would be what in religious language is called mortal sin, the worst, the unforgivable crime or harm. There is only forgiveness, if there is any, when there is the unforgivable. That is to say that forgiveness must announce itself an impossibility itself. He calls it an aporia, meaning something that is a contradiction in itself and unsolvable. Pure and unconditional forgiveness, in order to have its own meaning, must have no meaning, no finality, even no intelligibility. It is madness of the impossible. And yet it happened. It truly happened. The Jewish philosopher interprets Jesus himself on the cross authentically as something that happened. He makes a philosophical statement that happens in real life of the divine and the human person. Is it possible also in us humans? I would like to think so, because Jesus was truly human. Let us reflect on the gospel account. The text of the words on the cross that I read in the beginning are taken from the Gospel of St. Luke. In fact, this text is found only in the Gospel of St. Luke. While all the Gospels bring out the same message, the Gospel of Luke has a special concern for forgiveness and the impossibleness. The word impossible has played an important role in my reflections thus far on forgiveness. Nothing is impossible with God. Luke 1:37 is the unambiguous conclusion of the gospel passage, of the opening passage of Luke's gospel, the Annunciation. The impossible happens due to the divine involving with the human. This is echoed in other gospels as well, especially concerning physical miracles. The possibility of forgiveness, the impossible being made possible, lies in the unconditional love of God, in God Himself. God so loved the world that He gave His only Son to mankind. In fact, the Bible is the record of God's unconditional love and goodness to Israel. Israel represents all humanity. God asks for nothing. The Israelites believe in this so much that they even think that God is on their side to kill their enemy. This is only their human way of expressing God's total love and faithfulness to them. The Bible is also the record of God's unconditional forgiveness to Israel. As the people of Israel go away from God time and again, even Moses and David and Solomon, every one of them who God chose, backed out and sinned, and God forgave. The message is, God is always good to us, and God forgives despite everything. The high point of this unconditional love is Jesus Himself. The Gospels are about Jesus doing good for no reason and no returns, and about Jesus forgiving for no reason and for no returns. Doing good and forgiving are two sides of the coin of unconditional love. The Gospel of Luke once again spells out the message of Jesus in an impossible agenda for humans. Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." To illustrate how this can and should be done, Luke gives us perhaps the two best known parables of the Bible: the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the prodigal son. These parables are found only in the Gospel of Luke. The Good Samaritan remains the exemplar of unconditional human goodness, who goes beyond himself to someone he does not know, expecting no returns and no profits. Pure goodness. The father in the parable of the prodigal son needs nothing from the son in order to forgive him. Not even the word sorry. He has forgiven his son the moment his son rejected him. The impossible is possible when one forgives. That really illustrates to us what unconditional love means. One speaks of doing good unconditionally to all people, irrespective of who they are and what they have done. And on the other hand, that will never perfectly happen. The forgiveness for humans, especially Semitic religions, unlike the Jesuit model or the model on the cross, has become more of juridical penance or a matter of justice with a lot of conditions. I will forgive if you express sorrow or contrition. I will forgive if you make restitution or amends. I will forgive if you promise to the best of your ability not to re-offend. I will forgive if you do penance, as Father Michael Whelan puts it. In fact, the sacrament of confession is sometimes interpreted on this quasi-barter or trade. The forgiveness of Jesus lays no condition. Look at the pattern of forgiveness. Normally we think that guilt comes first, then remorse, then forgiveness. This reflects ordinary human experience. Divine forgiveness is an unconditional gift that overtakes remorse. Remorse is not what brings on forgiveness, but the opposite. Forgiveness brings out remorse not as a condition for finding freedom, but as a result of an overwhelming experience. The father does not need the remorse of the prodigal son to forgive him. He has already forgiven him the day he left the house. The remorse of the son comes from later, from the knowledge that the father loves him, come what may. It gives him confidence to come back like a tiny child to the loving mother. C.S. Lewis once remarked that the Apostle Peter in his later life would likely have told everyone the story of how he betrayed the Lord and done so with a radiant face, since on that night he had been drawn into an unimaginable depth of love through a single glance. The Lord turned and looked at Peter, and he went out and wept bitterly. Luke 22:61-62. The loving gaze of Jesus on Peter overwhelms Peter to remorse and repentance. And hence says the Gospel, if therefore you are offering your gift at the altar, and therefore remember that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift before the altar and go your way. Forgive your brother. The sacrament of penance is not a quid pro quo with God, a sort of bargaining that I do penance and God reciprocally forgives. It is the result of God's divine gaze on us. The very act of going to confession is a gift of God's forgiveness. The remorse and reparation are the fruits of true reconciliation and not preconditions. Are we open to the gaze of God? Remember, the gaze of Jesus on the cross did not touch his torturers as it did Peter. Instead, after he said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, they continued further and put lots for his robe. How does all this impact us humans? Luke has written the Acts of the Apostles. It is a follow-up of the Gospels. The first martyr of Christianity, Saint Stephen, utters words similar to that of Jesus when he is stoned to death. And falling to his knees, he cried out and said with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Acts 7:60. He asks God to forgive them. He prays for a divine act. It is an assertion that humans can forgive when God is with them. Stephen did what Jesus did on the cross. Christian understanding of the human leads on the Imago Dei as its foundation. In simple terms, our understanding of the human person is the biblical expression that we are made in the image and likeness of God in the book of Genesis. Jesus was divine and human. Humans are made like God. They have the spark of the divine in them. If humankind can forgive, it is precisely because the divine within us makes the impossible possible. Hence, for Christians, Jesus' behavior in the world functions as a model. Forgiveness becomes a key for Jesus to reveal his divinity in his humanness. He maintained companionship with sinners, and this companionship had no conditions. To employ Jacques Derrida's language regarding forgiveness, something mad, something impossible marks Jesus' behavior, and that is the divine. At the outset, I spoke of so many reasons that stop me from forgiving. And yet forgiveness does happen in our lives, albeit in various degrees of possible impossibility. It is inborn within us and is awakened when we are deeply united with God, so that we are consciously living our love through goodness and forgiveness. Alexander Pope's "to err is human, to forgive is divine" does not refer to Jesus. It is about humans letting the divine in them spark. Acts of forgiveness in our lives are sparks of the divine that radiate love around us. They are moments of transfiguration in our lives, which give the divine touch to our fellow beings and elevate ourselves. The more we are aware of our divine connection, the more probable we are to forgive. The more improbable the event of forgiveness to mere human eyes, the holier we are. In spiritual terms, the real test of our union with God and our life of prayer is our capability to forgive. Like Gladys Staines, wife and mother of the Staines family, who forgave the murderers of her husband and children. Like the parents of Sister Rani Maria, who forgave the murder of their daughter. Like Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, who visited the person who attempted to murder him. Or Nelson Mandela in Africa. The list of the impossible being made possible is many in human history and unrecorded in day-to-day life. They are human repetitions of the moment on the cross we have been talking about. They are transfigurative moments. They are saintly moments. The Pope was in Iraq a couple of days ago. He went to Mosul and Karakosh, two cities which had sizable Christian populations and which have been decimated in the war. But they have been decimated not just for Christians, but also for Muslims. The Pope addressed both Muslims and Christians. He said, what is needed is the ability to forgive, but also the courage not to give up forgiveness. Forgiveness is necessary to remain in love, to remain Christian. The Reverend Raid Kallo was among the few Christians who returned to Mosul after the IS was defeated. He said in front of the Pope, My Muslim brothers received me after the liberation of the city with great hospitality and love. Before, Reverend Kallo had a parish of 500 Christian families. Now only 70 families remain. He said, "But today I live among 2 million Muslims who call me Father Kallo." The Pope's words were not theory. They did happen in Mosul. Do not think only of Mosul in Iraq. There are moments of transfiguration every day in our lives, for we hurt each other, and even small hurts appear to be impossible to forgive, believe me. How many marriages reach to the verge of breakdowns because of simple misunderstandings that later become impossibilities to our eyes? Misunderstandings turn to enmities. The more devout you appear in church, sometimes the stronger our enmities. I think of even us priests who celebrate the Eucharist and still nurture inane grudges. How many of us religious and priests go on living a good community life without really reaching out to others in reconciliation, even in small matters? I remember in our younger days in the seminary, 2 of our companions fought with each other because of a couple of biscuits. It took them a year to reconcile for a biscuit. Jacques Derrida calls these venial sins, and he deems them not even worthy to be called forgiveness, but they are forgiveness. Positively speaking, I can list the thousands of day-to-day forgiveness events in families and schools and workplaces, etc., which actually make this world a holier place. We see sparks of the lights of transfiguration in day-to-day life. It does happen because we have the divine within us. Every act of forgiveness is the divine within us. It is the authentic sign of holiness. My favorite phrase about marriage is, a happy marriage is between 2 forgiving people. It is love divine. In marriage, normally it is one person who has to forgive thanks to all the excuses the other has, as I said earlier. And this applies to many families. Families are good when there are forgiving people all around. Pope Francis calls the family the school of forgiveness. He says, within the family we learn how to forgive because we are certain that we are understood and supported whatever the mistakes we make. Families are where unconditional love happens or is supposed to happen. Unfortunately, if this does not happen, we are schooled not to forgive even in the family. In a talk on value education and holistic formation to KG teachers, I said, the greatest value that we have to inculcate in our children is to enable them to realize the divine within themselves. That is, to create an atmosphere for doing good and an atmosphere of forgiveness and conflict resolution. This is to me the most important ambience of value for education today. And it begins with all the staff themselves. As kids are not taught, they just catch it from the elders. One of the criteria that I thought was essential in evaluating a seminarian was, when I was rector of the Pilar Seminary, was this capacity to reach out and resolve conflicts and differences. It is the prime measure of spiritual growth. To the famous adage of Alexander Pope, which I am now quoting for a 3rd time, I add, to err is human, to forgive is divine, revenge is the Satan. I would even modify it to say, not forgiving is not human. Lent is a special time for living deeply in union with the Lord, which alone will enable us to let the sparks of forgiveness illuminate our environment. I asked you to reflect on some people you need to forgive or who need to forgive you. Perhaps no one will ever crucify us like Jesus was, or they may in some ways. But we do have a lot of tiny grudges and even serious differences. Could we let go? Could we let God take over our lives and let the divine spark of forgiveness go to some of them? If not today or tomorrow, at least by Good Friday? Sorry, I should not advise you. I will try that first myself. Pray for me. And when I cannot forgive, I only hope Jesus will pray for me and say, Father, forgive him, for he knows not what he is doing. I'm sure he will. God bless you.